Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen. This is where trainers in the law enforcement space come to hear the experts talk about their work, their experience, and research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practice. Our desire here at the Bullpen is to advance law enforcement training, make research applied, and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host. And today it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Arne Nieuwenhuys. Dr. Nieuwenhuys is Senior Lecturer in Sport, Exercise, and Performance Psychology. He obtained his PhD from VU University Amsterdam. And prior to coming to New Zealand, he worked as assistant professor at Radboud University, Nijmegen in the Netherlands. At the University of Auckland, Dr. Nieuwenhuys is leader of the postgraduate research program in exercise sciences. He conducts research on the effects of anxiety, sleep, and fatigue on human movement and performance. And he teaches several undergraduate and postgraduate courses in sport, exercise, and performance psychology. Dr. Nieuwenhuys is associate editor of the Journal of Sport and Exercise Science and the European Journal of Sports Science. Dr. Nieuwenhuys' research has been funded by national science foundations in New Zealand and the Netherlands, as well as industry and sports, such as the Netherlands Police Force and Netherlands Olympic Committee, and focuses on how psychophysiological states such as anxiety, fatigue, and sleep influence human movement and performance. His work ranges from experimentally controlled studies that are conducted in the lab to field experiments and monitoring studies that are conducted among specific target populations such as athletes, soldiers, and police officers. By understanding how critical cognitive motor functions are affected by changes in the individual's psychophysiological state, Dr. Nieuwenhuys aims to develop evidence-based interventions that help people improve their performance in those situations where it counts the most. Law enforcement being the one we're going to talk about specifically today. Dr. Nieuwenhuys, welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, so I read with great interest, Doctor, your research paper that you and your colleagues conducted, which was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology. And the title of that paper is The Positive Effects of Imagery on Police Officers' Shooting Performance Under Threat. And for our audience, that paper is going to be appended to the show notes. So as always, I encourage you to download a copy of that paper, thoroughly digest that paper, reflect on the findings, the discussion, and the implications while you watch and follow along with this interview. So one of the things that is obviously critical in law enforcement, Dr. Nieuwenhuys, is that officers are able to perform well under conditions, high conditions of pressure. And so as we well know and is evidenced frequently, officer judgment, their perception, their decision-making, their motor performance can be severely degraded by the effects of pressure in those operational settings. And so I would like to ask you, first of all, what led you to go down this road of wanting to examine imagery and its effects on police officer shooting performance?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Chris. Look, as always, there's kind of two sides to that story. One would be a scientific one, and the other one would be kind of like a police applied practice one. From a scientific perspective, I think we're at a stage where we kind of know a lot about imagery, how it works, why it might be beneficial for motor learning and performance. We might get to speak about that a little bit more later. But what we know quite little of still is the extent to which imagery can also be used to prepare for these kind of high pressure situations. Can you use imagery effectively to kind of help maintain performance under those high pressure circumstances? So that was the scientific question that we wanted to address, focusing on the emotional aspects of imagery. From an applied perspective, this research was performed at the time I was in the Netherlands, and like in many countries across the world, I'm sure the time that officers have available for kind of practicing their skills after they graduate from academy in the Netherlands, they only come back to the training center 4 times a year. I think they've got an accumulated 32 hours or so of practice available per year, and that is not much. What the Netherlands police force at the time was implementing was a mental training workshop, which each officer, working officer, had to complete. In that workshop, there were several psychological skills being taught and integrated to some extent in operational skills. It was just a 2-day workshop, so we might come to speak about how beneficial 2 days of mental practice can potentially be. But one of those skills was imagery, and we wanted to know from that applied perspective, is it helpful to engage officers in a brief imagery workshop? To what extent can that help kind of their, in this case, handgun shooting performance under high pressure?
Okay, great. And so before we get into the meat of your study, because we're going to be talking about imagery, so maybe so that we all have the same framework in our mind when we think about imagery, can you tell us, what is imagery? And we've often heard the term visualization as well. So maybe you can tell us, what is imagery? Is it the same or different than visualization, or what's the nuances there?
Yeah, good question for starters. I think the term visualization is pretty much used conversationally. Imagery actually involves more than again the visual sense, and I think a textbook definition of imagery would probably be kind of creating or recreating an experience in the mind. And with imagery, that should and can involve all of the senses. So beyond vision, think about kinesthetic sense, auditory sense, olfactory, anything that kind of makes up a real life experience can be involved in the imagery for benefit of motor learning and performance.
Okay. All right. And imagery itself, so you were looking at it specifically with relation to law enforcement performance, but of course, imagery is something that has been used for an awful long time in high-level athletics, Olympic level sporting events, and even going back further into the fields of martial arts, as we spoke about before we began the interview. So what can you tell us about that? Like, so you're taking concepts that have been used and well researched, and the documentation on their effectiveness in other domains, and you're looking at the effectiveness in law enforcement. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, actually, of course, imagery and mental preparation for that matter is a very natural thing to engage in. Think of any. It doesn't have to be about sports or law enforcement. Think of any kind of important moment in your life. You try and get ready for that, and people spontaneously engage in some form of mental preparation in the period leading up to that important moment of performance. And like you say. From experience and later from science that was conducted to establish foundations around the effects of imagery, we've taken some of those elements, implemented them in a law enforcement context. These days, there's quite a bit of evidence around the effectiveness of imagery, not just at the level of performance, but we also understand these days a lot more about why imagery is potentially effective. If we consider that what we know now with the kind of brain imaging techniques that we have available in our research, what we see happening with imagery, if it is done properly, so if the scene or experience that you're imagining is actually very similar to how that skill is performed in real life. What we see happening at the level of the brain is actually activating of the same neural networks that support skill execution in real life. So even though there's not the physical execution of the movement, we still see the same temporal activation in neural networks that supports skill execution in real life. And that is an important basis for understanding why imagery can be an important add-on in the learning, practicing, and maintaining of motor skills.
Okay, so a couple of things I'd like to follow up on there. So you mentioned that people spontaneously practice some form of imagery. Now, because oftentimes I think because of the way our human nature is, that often that imagery is not imagining positive outcomes, is it?
Yeah.
It's dwelling on our inabilities, our inefficiencies. It's dwelling on the possible negative outcomes of things that are going to happen. And so because we're talking about the relationship between positive goal focused performance enhancement imagery, but have they also done studies that have shown that that negative aspect of imagery, how does that relate to human performance, especially in these very high consequence dynamic situations?
Absolutely, it's a critical point. Yes is the answer, and so there's two sides to it. Imagine, like from what I was just explaining, right, how we think imagery contributes to motor learning and performance. That kind of, what is it, representativeness and what is it, neuromechanical equivalence of the imagery and the actual kind of performing of the skill in daily life. If you imagine skill execution that is unsuccessful, you're basically training your mind to do the wrong thing. Of course, there's that kind of motor learning component to it. You're just kind of practicing error making, really. But there's also the psychological component of how that impacts your confidence that you kind of bring into the situation that you're entering.
Okay, so with respect to motor learning, then, as you mentioned, the neuroimaging techniques that they now show that at a functional brain level, there's changes when we imagine ourselves even about to perform an action. Is that occurring at, like, is that at the level of the motor cortex where they're seeing that activation, or what's happening?
Absolutely. So there's several areas of the brain involved in the control of movement. So what we see in terms of similar neural networks being activated is of course the motor cortex, which is required to kind of activate the muscles involved in the movement to the point where it actually leads to kind of electrical signals that descend to the muscles that are involved in skill execution, just at a level. So muscles are actually activated during imagery, and in the same, if the imagery is done correctly, in the same temporal sequence as during the actual execution of the skill. It's just that the activation levels are so low that it doesn't lead to the same kind of overt behavioral movement that we can see. Yeah, so you can record that at the level of the brain, you can record that at the level of the muscle even as well during imagery. Other areas in the brain that are involved, particularly around decision making, maintaining attentional focus, is of course more prefrontal areas of the brain. We see those being involved in the imagery as well.
Okay, that's almost mind-boggling to
Yeah.
think that just imagining yourself doing an event in preparation for, even through training, through learning, how you can actually already start to prime and develop those motor programs without actually even performing the skill
Yes, you'd
is
almost become lazy. Yeah.
well, yeah, don't tell my wife that I can just sit on the couch and imagine myself mowing the lawn.
Mm.
Okay. So you mentioned in the paper, you use the terms imagery and guided imagery. And so
Yeah.
help our listeners understand. So what is imagery and how is it different than guided imagery?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, people spontaneously engage in imagery all the time. What we differ in tremendously is our capability of controlling the images, right? Like you were saying, sometimes we tend to engage in negative imagery, sometimes we're unable to control what we're imagining. Um, Guided imagery is a form of imagery that helps us kind of keep the narrative the way we want it to be. So imagine being in the presence of a coach, an instructor who can talk you through the scene, the execution of the motor skill that you would like to imagine, and making sure that it's done correctly. So that guided imagery is really important in kind of learning the imagery process. And of course, it doesn't have to always be kind of a physical instructor or a coach. You can work with audio tapes as well, and that you record and use during your learning and acquiring of imagery. So saying that imagery in itself is actually a skill that you should develop and learn before you're able to kind of implement it independently in kind of a self-guided way.
All right. So would your advice then be, Doctor, for law enforcement trainers, if they're going to be including imagery into their training sessions, that especially maybe with new learners or ones who haven't practiced imagery before, that they start with guided imagery scripts and they control that script, they control the scene, rather than just, like you said, just handing it over to the students?
Absolutely.
Okay, and then at what point would there be some cues that a trainer would know that you can start trends? Because I mean, the ideal goal would be that you want your students to leave your training. Let's say it's an academy that we've got for 5 months or 6 months, and we've got these students. The goal would be ultimately when they graduate from our academy, we've transitioned them from being dependent upon guided imagery into now when they're out doing their own work in the field, they can perform that independently. Yeah. So what would be the cues? How would one know when to transition?
Yeah, good point. Of course, in an academy or any kind of applied context, we wouldn't necessarily have all the instruments to measure brain activity and see the extent to which that resembles the activity during real life execution. So the tools that we've got is pretty much probing the extent to which people are able to control imagery, or even in guided imagery, are able to kind of implement the instructed image correctly and successfully. So there is questionnaires available, brief questionnaires that you can use to probe different aspects of the imagery. Controllability is one. Success, of course, is another one. Stability, and also the perspective from which people kind of imagine themselves perform the skill. So there's questionnaires of doing that. During my classes, so I do these very brief imagery kind of, sessions with my students in class as well, just to demonstrate what it looks like and what it feels like. And I simply use the question like, who was able to imagine that successfully, or who kind of experienced some mind wandering and some altering of whatever we were imagining during the process. And I think the probing of imagery quality and success during that learning process is important. And when people are able to kind of imagine in a guided imagery setting the scenes with a high degree of control and a high degree of stability and success, I think that is when you can start to work towards self-guided imagery.
Okay, great. And so let's start looking at your study here, Doctor. Tell us, so what were the goals of your research? What were you looking at? And tell us a bit about your methodology. How did you undertake this study?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so this work was performed in collaboration directly with the Netherlands Police Academy. So probably similar as in Canada, Netherlands has different kind of regions, but there is also a national academy, and this is where that study was performed. And one of the authors on the study is actually an instructor there who helped us carry out the study. What we wanted to find out is the extent to which imagery, and in particular emotion-focused imagery, might potentially help officers to maintain performance under high anxiety, high pressure. As you said at the start, we've found, like, and this is an observation, of course, in practice, but we've also done quite a few experiments demonstrating the effect that when officers are put under high levels of pressure, a lot of their operational skills deteriorate, and that includes handgun shooting performance, which is the skill that we focused on in this particular imagery experiment. So we wanted to see whether emotion-focused imagery could help officers to maintain their handgun shooting performance under high pressure. We had, I think, 60 odd officers involved in the study. So these are all working police officers who are licensed to carry a handgun on duty, different levels of experience, but that was balanced out across three groups that we created. With any experiment, if you do science, you're interested in the effects of imagery, so you conduct some imagery with some of the officers, but you need to contrast that with a group of people who do the same kind of task but who don't engage in the imagery, right? Like you control the circumstances under which you perform the experiment to kind of isolate the factor that you're interested in this case, imagery. Now we divided those 60 officers across 3 groups. One group did what we called execution imagery, focusing on performing a certain shooting drill. I'll get to that. And in the process, making sure that they focused on the targets that they were instructed to hit. Execution imagery. Then we had an emotion execution imagery group, which pretty much did the same as the other imagery group, but what we did here is we added that element of being under high levels of pressure, regulating and managing your emotions, and despite the high pressure that you're faced with, being able to focus still on those targets that you were instructed to hit. And then we had a control group who did not engage in imagery. And like I said, people spontaneously engage in imagery. So to prevent that control group from spontaneously engaging in imagery, we had them listen to an audio script, some news items that they had to recall some facts from, just to make sure that they could not spontaneously engage in the imagery. So we had a shooting drill. Not sure whether it's relevant to explain that in detail, but it involved actual handgun shooting in kind of a real life setting, using the same handgun as police officers in the Netherlands use on duty, but then specifically prepared to fit collared soap cartridges. So we could actually check whether people hit the targets that they were aiming at, and people were shooting at an offender, an assailant, who was of course fitted with targets that we instructed the officers to hit, but then pointing a handgun back at the officers as well. So for starters, all the officers across all the 3 groups performed the same shooting drill under low threat circumstances, meaning that the offender, the assailant that they were facing, was pointing a handgun at them, but that was a blue gun, not possible to pull the trigger or fire any actual kind of collared soap cartridges back at the officers. So relatively low threat, realistic but low threat circumstances. All 3 groups performed that shooting drill, and we recorded their shooting accuracy. Then the group split to kind of undergo their respective treatments: execution imagery, execution emotion imagery, or the control condition. Then we came back to the practice scene, and people did the same shooting exercise again, but now under high threat circumstance. So in this case, the assailant was kind of pointing an actual handgun at the officers, at the participants in the study, loaded with collared soap cartridges. We made sure that across the shooting drill, each officer was hit at random moments twice. As some of your listeners might be familiar with being hit with these cartridges, or kind of knowing that you can be hit with these kind of collared soap bullets. It's not a very pleasant experience. It does create a bit of anxiety, and so that was performance in a high threat circumstance. Yeah, that's how the experiment was performed. Would you like me to speak about what the results look like?
Well, in just a minute. So it's a couple of things I want to first just make sure I have clear. So all 3 groups first went through, basically you did a baseline test before the interventions, right? So they all went through the force on force scenario with the individual. And so when you say soap cartridges, I think here we refer to those typically as simunitions that shoot the very, very painful projectile. So there's a pain penalty, and that causes obviously the anxiety response in the officers. So the 3 groups went through the baseline, and then they were split off and had their various interventions. So one group was your control group, got no intervention, just and then the second group was given imagery, and then the third group had emotion-based imagery. Is that correct?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. All right. And so with the emotion-based imagery, was it imagery that had them focus on receiving injury and pain and discomfort and still being able to maintain focus despite that, or what was like the content of that emotion-based imagery?
Yeah, good point. It was similar to that, really. Then again, one of the constraints in in guided imagery. So with imagery, like I said, it's important that it's representative of the actual execution of the skill. And one thing that is important to keep similar is kind of the temporal nature. So how long does it take to execute the skill in real life? If you start to imagine things in slow motion, positive effects of imagery are less compared to when you imagine performing the skill in kind of real time. And that has to do with the fact that we don't just need to have kind of the equivalent neural networks involved, but also have them involved in the same kind of temporal organization and speed as in the actual process. What that means for guided imagery is that there's limitations to what you can include in the script, because if you include a lot of kind of environmental factors and detail, the script is going to be very long and not representative of the actual duration of the drill in this case. What we did include in terms of emotional components was, yes, just the awareness, making people aware of the fact that there was this kind of simulation weapon pointed at them, and how that impacted their feeling state. So feeling anxious, feeling tense around the possibility of being hit. Yes, we also did include I think one moment where we had people imagine actually being hit, so the assailant's gun being fired and actually being hit, feeling what that felt like, which is a bit of a burning pain after the impact, of course. And then despite that kind of distraction, apprehension, and pain, returning focus to what you came there to do, which was hitting those targets. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. And you mentioned also, you spoke about representativeness and the importance of that. And in your paper, you also used the term functional equivalence. So are those synonymous terms, Doctor, meaning the same thing?
Yes, I think that would be fair enough.
Okay, so what's really important then is that if you're performing imagery or doing guided imagery, that you want to make sure the content of that imagery as closely as possible represents the criterion environment, the states that
Yes.
that is going to be occurring in. And that's what you mean by representativeness.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. And so then one more thing, just before we get to the results, which were fascinating, but you used a model of imagery, because there's various different models that are out there, but I think one of the most common ones that I've seen and read about, especially in the sports literature, is this model called PETTLEP, PETTLEP.
Yeah.
And so that's the model that you use. Can you tell us about that? What is PETTLEP? What does it stand for? And even where does it come from?
Yeah. So thanks. Yeah. So PETTLEP is a model that does come from sports, and it basically is a system, a way of working that helps people achieve functional equivalence, that element of representativeness as they execute the imagery. It's about how you organize the environment in which you perform the imagery, how you pitch the imagery, and go about it to make sure that the likelihood of that functional equivalence occurring during the imagery is as great as possible. So PETTLEP itself, it does come from sports, and there is really the name PETTLEP is an acronym for several elements that you, as kind of imagery providers, or for yourself if you're doing the imagery, can just take into account when you design the imagery in the first place. Yeah. The stereotypical image of people doing imagery is that you kind of lie on a sofa or something, close your eyes and engage in some kind of mental experience. The first letter of the acronym, the P of PETTLEP, actually means physical. And what that stands for is that we can allow the imagery to be somewhat physical. So allowing small movements can help to visualize scenes in a representative manner. in the imagery, for instance, thinking about, we didn't do that, I think, in this experiment, but you could facilitate imagery by actually having people hold a handgun as they would imagine this scene. To that extent, physical. And same, the other letters. E is environment. Imagery is more easy to perform if you're in the same environment, more or less, or a similar environment as where you perform the actual skill as well. T stands for time, the temporal organization of the imagery. Then the L for learning. It doesn't really work to have people with a lower skill level imagine a level of performance that is way beyond their actual capacity. So you need to pitch the imagery. Success is important, but it shouldn't be unrealistic. You need to pitch the level of performance during the imagery at the level of people's actual capacity. That's what the L stands for. The other L, my goodness, there's a few. But E, the second E definitely stands for emotion as well. So to the extent that the actual performance is characterized by strong emotional experiences, PETTLEP would predict that incorporating those emotions in your imagery as well can help you kind of perform that skill, either despite the emotions that you experience, which is what we focused on, or you can use it to kind of rehearse effective managing of your emotions in that situation.
Okay. And then I think, does the last P, does that stand for perspective?
It does, yes,
okay.
it does. And in that sense, a first-person perspective for these kind of motor execution imagery practices, a first-person perspective has by far the most beneficial effects.
Oh, really? So the research would say that if I'm imagining myself going through a situation, doing it like through my own first person
Yes,
lens, then rather than like a third person.
absolutely. Yes.
Oh, okay.
And look, the reason for that, Chris, is again that functional equivalence. And of course, that is about kind of what is it? The motor commands that you're producing, but it is also about connecting those motor commands to the visual information that you need in order to coordinate your motor movements, right? So having that first person perspective, seeing the scene that you would be seeing in real life from that first person perspective, taking up that visual information, even though it's imagined, like you would in real life, is important to kind of like create that perception action connection that we definitely need to be having.
Okay, great. So, and you also mentioned under the physical component, doctor, you said that even like if you're holding your handgun, or so, is there an enhanced benefit if the students are in the environment that they're actually going to be performing the task or the training? So say, for example, if I'm going to be doing emergency response driving or pursuit driving, if I have my officers sitting in their vehicles while preparing to do that, and we do the imagery there, is that better than having them sit in the classroom before we then go out to the cars?
Yeah. When you're very much practiced, you will find that you can pretty much do the imagery anywhere. When you still have some difficulty kind of recreating those experiences, then this can definitely help. There's a fantastic video that I tend to show in class, and I can send you the link, Chris, of some Formula One drivers doing imagery in a very kind of PETTLEP kind of way, where they don't necessarily sit in their cars, but they do hold kind of a steering wheel, so they're able to shift gears and stuff. To kind of help them or to facilitate the producing of that imagery.
Yeah. Okay. That's fantastic. And so then would your recommendation be, especially maybe with new learners, is if we're in, say, the combatives room, we're doing DT training, that if we're going to do handcuffing, that they have their handcuffs in their hand or their baton. So is it beneficial to have like that kinesthetic connection to the tool?
Great point. I was just about to say that, because remember that imagery is not just visual information, not just the visual sense, and of course, kind of this kinesthetic sense and actually holding the object that you use to perform the skill, or being in the same room and kind of having that same smell of the room even, is things that are incorporated in the producing of the imagery and make it more of a realistic experience. Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So yeah, now let's get into your results. So what did you find out in your study?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so as said, normally what you'd expect is that when people are put under pressure, so we took that baseline under low threat circumstances. Normally what you'd see is that when you kind of then put people under high pressure, so we call that our high threat condition, when people could get hit by those, call it soap simulation. Um, um, you would expect shooting accuracy or shot accuracy to decrease. People's skill execution deteriorates when they're under high pressure. This is exactly what we saw in the control condition. So the people that didn't do the imagery, as predicted, they showed a significant decline in their shooting accuracy, the number of hits on the targets. The two imagery groups, both of them actually, were able to maintain definitely maintain, slightly but non-significantly so improve even their shot execution despite performing under the same high levels of threat. So in terms of maintaining performance, but also the contrast between our control group and our intervention groups showed us that, yes, imagery is effective. And then we had those two imagery groups, one that just focused on the execution of the skill, the other that included those emotional components as well. And we were not able to establish a significant difference between the performance of those two groups. Yeah.
Okay, so both the imagery groups had substantial improvements in accuracy over the control group. So the bottom line there is that imagery was effective in improving performance and shooting accuracy compared to officers who don't practice imagery. Is that?
Imagery helps to maintain shot accuracy under high levels of threat.
Good, great. And what's your thoughts on why did you not see what you expected to see with respect to the emotion aspect of the imagery?
Yeah, good point. And we spent some time discussing that, of course, in the article itself as well. It is a bit speculating, but of course the shared component between those two groups is the actual execution part of it. So making sure that you focus on the targets that you're instructed to hit. Yes, we had anticipated even more positive effects in the emotion execution group. What we think might have happened is, like I said, there's some constraints in working with guided imagery. You have to squeeze extra information into the same amount of time that you have available, which arguably makes that you're potentially not doing the best possible job there. You have to make some compromises in terms of content. Another thing that could have happened is that it's more complex. Right? Instead of having just one focus point in your imagery, you have two focus points, focusing on the targets, but also managing your emotions. Given that this, for most of those officers, was the first time they engaged in imagery, guided imagery, in this case, that is a difficult thing to do. And even though everybody in both of those intervention groups indicated that they were able to successfully imagine the scene, and this was a control question that we asked everybody, it might be that the quality of the images in the emotion execution group was a little bit less for that sheer difficulty of combining two goals into the same kind of time that we had available.
Okay. What are your thoughts on how focus of attention would play into the performance? Because the one group that's focused externally on task, on goal, on outcome, has that goal-directed external focus of attention, which we know is optimal for good performance. And so do you think that maybe by having them shift into an internal broad focus of attention to monitor their internal state, would that also have added to maybe some difficulty in the performance?
Yeah, good. Yeah. That's a fair point. We know from a lot of earlier experiments where we had officers do similar shooting drills and also kind of had them wear eye trackers, that the reason, or one of the reasons I should say, why shot accuracy deteriorates under high threat is that because when you're under high threat, you tend to be more distracted, or it's more difficult for you to remain focused long enough to on the targets visually to coordinate your movements in direction of those targets. People tend to be kind of focusing on the threat, literally visual representation of the threat that they're confronted with. in those circumstances. So that is one of the reasons why you think, oh yes, that attentional focus, focusing on the target's visual control of movement, is essential, and maintaining that for a long enough amount of time to coordinate your movements appropriately. Yes, potentially there was an element where the emotion focus group would have kind of had a little bit of more internal focus of attention, regulating their emotions, which would have subtracted from that external focus. At the same time, let's not forget that the emotion focus group performed statistically at the same level and was also able to maintain their shot accuracy under high threat, which is no small feat. That is a very significant outcome. So it couldn't have subtracted from the positive effect too much, or from that kind of external focus, goal-directed focus too much. The only thing that it did is it didn't cause or help establish kind of that extra positive effect.
Right. Perfect. Good. And you mentioned in your report or in your paper as well that the goal of this imagery was not to reduce anxiety. It was to allow officers to perform in that state of anxiety. So maybe can you tell us the difference? Because I know there's imagery that can be conducted, that it can be intended to lower your physiological state, but that's not what you were looking at. So help us understand that.
Yeah, thanks. Fair point. And really, like for implementation, both are very important, right? But there's always, in these experiments, you need to make a choice. And so yes, our rationale was that look, there is going to be moments in your job as a police officer where you're unexpectedly kind of confronted with a very high threat situation, and there may not be time to spend kind of regulating your emotional response because you need to act now. So a lot of our research has always focused on kind of acclimatizing skill execution to that kind of high threat, high anxiety state that officers might find themselves in, which is not to say that there is definitely moments where you know and kind of can anticipate that you might be entering a high threat encounter, and that if there is time, it can be really beneficial to say work with emotion regulation, arousal regulation techniques to manage your emotional response. Also, more cognitive techniques to manage the thoughts and worries, etc., that you might be experiencing. And you can use imagery also for that purpose, right? So if that is what you want to be doing, like with any kind of training and coaching, drills need to have a certain element of focus. This specific imagery intervention was focused on maintaining attentional focus despite high levels of anxiety. A different imagery intervention might have focused on kind of having officers mentally prepare themselves, calm their nerves, and manage their emotional states prior to entering that situation.
Okay, great. So you've told us about the results of your study. And so, Doctor, what would your, if you had the ear of law enforcement trainers, what would your recommendations be as far as the incorporation of imagery into training?
Yeah, good point. Being a scientist, my first comment would or point would probably be, well, there's a few things that we might probably want to figure out and establish before we start to implement this in a real life kind of practice situation. There's a couple of questions really. Like, it's super positive results, obviously, but there's a few limitations to the study that we performed as well, which have kind of consequences for practical implementation. For one thing, now officers knew exactly the kind of scene that they were entering, right? Whereas in real life, you don't always know, or more often than not, you know less than you might want to, or things might turn out very different from what you were kind of having in terms of information prior to entering the scene. So one question that we would need to answer is kind of, does imagery also help in situations where the actual scenario ends up being slightly different from what you had expected, right? Is there this transfer to similar but not the same kind of situations? We need to establish that.
And sorry to interrupt, but on that point, is that transfer, has that been studied in sport? And does that transfer over to, as a sporting event unfolds, not in the same way is there still benefits to imagery?
Yeah, with a bit of caution, my answer would be yes, and we might speak about that a little bit more, because it has to do with how with how motor learning works, and how you don't necessarily have to be able or have to practice executing a motor skill in every particular environment or situation that you might be needing to perform that skill in order to be able to do so. Perhaps that sounds a bit more abstract and complex than it is, but yes, the answer would be yes. You can extrapolate from kind of exposure to similar constraints, similar situations. Think of it as what is it? Your brain being able to kind of draw a line between 2 or 3 different dots that could represent relevant kind of circumstances or contexts under which you perform a skill. Your brain is able to draw a line through that, and as such, by that, predict what it needs to do in order to perform that skill in one of the kind of points in between those dots, in similar yet not the same situation. So based on that kind of motor learning perspective, the prediction and careful evidence would suggest that yes, this should be possible. But I would very much like to establish that before I give police any kind of firm advice. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I guess very much like the motor learning principle of variability,
Yes.
is imagery should reflect, like you would not want to do imagery that's so linear to just one particular type of context. You would want to make it very rich and ecological. So every time you
Yes.
practiced it, you're introducing different variables, just like you would in the motor learning environment.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, great. And so that leads us, because I really want to, in the time we have remaining, and I know this is a research passion of yours as well, is this whole idea of task representativeness in training, and even how that leads into constraints-led approach to training, which is an area I'm becoming more and more fascinated with. So talk to us about that, Doctor, about task representativeness and why that's so important.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic. Yeah, so in learning a motor skill, and let's focus for the sake of simplicity. Let's focus on handgun shooting performance. Of course, there is certain kind of basics that you need to establish in the first place, and of course, this is looked after in academies and educating police officers. Knowing the temporal organization of the skill, etc., being able to perform it correctly. But then if you think about using the skill in real life circumstances, we know that there is several, if not countless, factors that have a significant impact on your quality of skill execution. And these can be variable. It can be physical constraints, say the posture from which you have to shoot, or your physical location, your orientation, relative position to the target. It can be environmental. Think of light, dark. Think of rain, or no rain. Think of like bright light, and other things. Think of moving objects. All these kind of factors we know impact the quality and success of skill execution. Also, if we consider handgun shooting performance, the time that you have available is another one. What we've shown in our research, other research than the experiment we were talking about just yet, is that of course emotional circumstances also impact on the quality of skill execution. Now, in motor learning, and specifically the constraints-led approach to motor learning, the idea is that you would need to expose your learners, your police officers in this case, you would need to expose them to those constraints in practice in order for the skill to acclimatize to those kind of particular conditions. Of course, that is something that happens spontaneously and naturally, because if you kind of execute a skill in daily life, at some point you'd be confronted with some circumstances, and you learn and you integrate, etc. But some of those circumstances only happen very occasionally. For a police officer in particular, kind of needing to use your handgun and execute kind of your shooting you're shooting in real life, it's not something that happens to the ordinary police officer very often, yet the impact is very significant, of course. So you cannot really wait for that event, that particular constraint to occur in real life, let alone often enough for the skill to acclimatize to be performed under those conditions. So what you would need to do is you kind of need to bring those constraints into the practice environment, make them part of the practice environment, kind of represent, in this case, focusing on, for instance, the high threat that you would want officers to be kind of able to successfully deal with. You need to bring that high threat into your practice environment, of course, in a safe and manageable kind of way. And Simonition is a fantastic tool to do that if we focus on the threat that officers might experience from the fact that you only use your handgun in potentially life-threatening situations. And I'm sure that a lot of your listeners who are police instructors would have different kind of things and tools that they bring out to kind of establish that. And why this works is exactly based on what I just tried to explain, is kind of by exposing people to specific constraints, and making sure that by rehearsing that, as with anything in practice, we establish some degree of success in performing the skill under those constraints, and then introducing slightly different constraints, the brain is able to extrapolate rather than a linear kind of form of practice. We introduce some variability, implement these constraints in practice. The brain is able to draw a line between all the dots, and you will find that people are able to accurately perform and successfully perform the skill in similar yet not the same kind of situations. You basically bring about a certain degree of adaptability in skill execution, a certain dexterity and flexibility in skill execution.
Okay. And so with task representativeness, because I can hear some law enforcement trainers responding to say, well, yeah, I do that. We do these high fidelity scenarios. We do these representative contextual type of drills. But often where those occur in the training regimen is like the last 10% of the officer's training, when they've spent 80 or 90% in a very linear, technique focused type of training environment. But I don't think that's what you're referring to here, right? Like, as I understand it, we should be encouraging our trainers to introduce contextual relevance as soon as possible in the training regimen.
Yes, you need to master the basic skill. That definitely that's a basis, but quite soon, and definitely much sooner than I have seen, we need to introduce these constraints in the practice environment. And of course, it shouldn't just be the emotional circumstances, but it should be all these things. One other thing is, for instance, the fact that a lot of shooting practice is based on kind of the idea that you already know that you're going to be shooting. We're focusing just on execution, whereas in real life, there's this really significant moment of needing to make the decision to perhaps draw your handgun in the first place. So practicing successful and accurate shooting in context of that kind of decision making is another one. And I'm sure that in terms of kind of the physical and environmental kind of context, there's an important, like a tremendous amount of constraints that need to be considered. And actually that's where it starts, identifying the important constraints on action in terms of performing the skill in real life, looking at ways of kind of bringing those and making those part of the practice environment in a safe way, then making sure that you organize your practice such that you don't do it in the last 10% or leave people with an unsuccessful kind of experience. Feedback needs to be integrated in order for the brain to adapt. So we definitely, apart from those moments where we do make errors or are unsuccessful, we need to also have success experiences to kind of know and learn how should we adapt the execution of this skill to be successful in this particular context.
Excellent. With regard to this idea of mastering the fundamentals, though, I'd like your opinion on this, because part of our challenge in sort of breaking out of this information processing type of mindset is putting our trainers in, like, adding that tactical relevance as soon as possible, even before our learners have mastered a technique, because because mastery can still occur within context, but often trainers will say, well, no, I don't want to add contextual relevance until I get them at a level of, perfect practice equals perfect performance kind of attitude. What would your thoughts be with respect to that?
Yeah, it's an important debate even in the motor learning kind of science and literature as well. I think the what is it? The generally accepted way of going about this would be that yes, there is a certain degree of basics that need to be established. So to some extent, this linear practice is required, but at a very basic level, and knowing the kind of different steps that are involved in executing a movement correctly, being able to kind of hit a target in the first place. Motor learning, you can traditionally divide that in 3 different stages. You got the acquisition phase, which is fairly verbal cognitive, where people actually need to kind of deliberately remind themselves of during the execution of what's involved to be able to correctly execute the skill in the first place. Then we've got the associative stage, where we start to integrate feedback from our environment to kind of perfect the skill and acclimatize to different contexts in which we perform. And then there's the kind of autonomous stage where a lot of that process, even the adaptability of skill execution, is no longer deliberate, but happens fairly kind of in a procedural kind of way without deliberately having to attend to it to a great extent. That first phase in the learning of a skill is something that can happen in a relatively linear fashion. Then the second stage, which you reach quite quickly, I would say, depending on the complexity of a skill, of course, is where we need to be introducing the various constraints that we're faced with in terms of executing the skill in real life.
Perfect. So the takeaway from this would be then, as soon as you are able, start introducing those contextual relevance, those constraints, the environmental relevance, the task relevance, and the performer relevance. And so would part of that changing performer, performer constraints would be like if a trainer had their students do, say, 10 or 15 minutes of a high intensity type of hit drill to drive up their physiology and then perform a skill, would that be a helpful way of helping them learn that skill or perform under those conditions?
It could be. What the question that we need to ask ourselves, I'd say, and this is regardless of context, whether it's policing or anything else, is the constraint that I'm introducing, is that one that in this case officers are confronted with frequently in executing that skill in daily life? Because we need to accept that the time that we have for training is limited, so we cannot possibly focus that scarce training time on all possible constraints. We need to prioritize the constraints, and in terms of that kind of order, introduce them, make them part of the practice environment. So to your question, if it is so that in a particular context officers are often in a state of physical exertion when they need to be performing their shooting skill, then yes, by all means, that should definitely be made part of the practice environment. If that is not the case, and other kind of environmental or physical emotional constraints are happening more frequent, then I would start with the ones that are perhaps having a slightly higher priority.
Okay, outstanding. Dr. Nieuwenhuys, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. And I would actually, and I know our listeners would love to have you back on to talk more about task representativeness, because I know there's a whole bunch more that we could really unpack to help trainers understand, how do I get my head wrapped around the whole idea of how do I measure task relevance? How do I know what my officers are encountering on the street? And then what is the methodology I should use to bring that into the training environment? So I think we'd really benefit from hearing from you on that topic as well. And just on this task representativeness, I want to let our listeners know that what we were just talking about here is specific to a commentary that Dr. Arne Nieuwenhuys wrote in Legal and Criminal Psychology in 2021. And that commentary was titled representative practice to improve police officer performance of operational skills in high stress situations. So we'll have a copy of that commentary, Doctor, as well, appended to the show notes for our listeners as well. I want to give you the last word, Doctor. Is there anything that you would like to say, questions you wished I would have asked you, points you want to get across to our listeners?
No, thank you, Chris, for inviting me on the podcast. And look, I think we managed to touch on a great deal of topics. Like you say, there's a lot more to kind of delve into if you want to. I'd just like to say to your listeners that you're very welcome to contact me via email. If you've got an interest in these things, or if you've got a question. I don't always have a lot of time, but I like kind of thinking about the practical implementation of things, and I encourage you, in fact, to engage with scientists and with me, definitely.
Is there a preferred email that you would like to have our listeners reach out to you at? Not your home phone number, but
not my home phone number, not my private personal email, but my work email will do. So if you Google my name and University of Auckland, you will fairly quickly find my email address and some relevant publications, perhaps, that you might be interested in reading as well.
Excellent. All right. Do you have anything? Well, I'm sure you do have something interesting, but are you able to tell us what's on your workbench now that you're excited to be working on?
Look, I'm easily excited, but two relevant things I'm working on at the moment. One is looking at the impact of sleep deprivation on these kinds of forms of skill execution, and also performing in these high threat circumstances. That is something I'm working on. Another thing I'm working on is inhibition control training. So learning to control our impulsive responses in these high threat circumstances. Reason for that is because that's one of the things we have found underlies errors in shooting decisions, for instance, that occur when officers are operating under high levels of stress. So what is it? Insufficient inhibitory control. So looking at ways of improving that.
Two critically important issues for law enforcement and public safety. Dr. Arne Nieuwenhuys, I want to thank you for what you do, for your work and your passion to help advance public safety and improve law enforcement. And we look forward to talking with you again in the future on the Trainer's Bullpen.
Thank you for having me.